Welcome to Massey College. Bienvenue au Collège Massey. My name is Natalie De Rosier, and I'm the principal of Massey College. Massey College is built on indigenous land, the land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. We want to acknowledge their duty of stewardship toward the land, and also our great privilege to continue to be here, to read good books. And today we will have the great book that we will be sharing with you. It's the book by Dr. Heberlein, On Love and Tyranny, the Life and Politics of Hannah Arendt. And to introduce us today, I think, is a fabulous junior fellow at Massey College. Stephanie Redekop is a PhD candidate in the Department of English at U of T. She holds an MA from Boston College, and her dissertation charts a literary history of American public discourse in the 60s. And she is supported by the Joseph Armand Bombardier Canada Graduate Scholarship, a Michael Smith Foreign Studies Supplement, the Center for the Study of the United States, the Center for Jewish Studies, and she also is the co-director of University of Toronto's American Literature Research Collaborative. And she is a junior fellow at Massey College, and she's speaking to us from her room at Massey College. Welcome, Stephanie. Up to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone for being here with us today to celebrate the publication of Dr. Anne Heberlein's new book, On Love and Tyranny, the Life and Politics of Hannah Arendt. Wonderful book, and I'm really looking forward to this chance to discuss it with Dr. Heberlein herself and our great panel. And I'll note that there will be time at the end for attendees to submit their questions to the panel, so get your questions ready. But let me first begin by introducing the author. Dr. Anne Heberlein is the best-selling author of more than a dozen books, including A Little Book on Evil, A Good Life, and the autobiographical I Don't Want to Die, I Just Don't Want to Live, which has sold hundreds of thousands of copies and has been translated into multiple languages and dramatized and mounted on several stages. In 2018, Heberlein debuted as a fiction writer with the novel Everything is Going to Be All Right. She has researched and taught at the Department of Practical Philosophy at Stockholm University and the Faculty of Theology at Lund University. Welcome, Anne. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, as we sort of just heard, you've got vast, writing publication experience in all kinds of different genres, and so I'm interested to hear a little bit more about what drew you to the genre of biography and of someone of such stature like Hannah Arendt. Throughout the book, you're continually making connections between the very intimate personal experiences of her life and sort of her large-scale moral and philosophical investments. And so I wonder if you might sort of speak to us a little bit about what sort of insights the practice of biography or the study of a life can allow us, and maybe how that manifests with Arendt's life in particular.
Well, actually, I got acquainted to or met Hannah Arendt when I was a student. I had an interest in questions concerning evil, responsibility, love, and most of all, forgiveness. And when I was going to write my doctoral thesis, I chose to write it on the subject of forgiveness. And then, of course, I had much use of Hannah and her thoughts on that topic, because, she has really sort of engaged in all these really big existential questions, on which forgiveness is one of them, of course, linked to guilt, shame, responsibility, and so on. And during my doctoral studies, I also got interested in the person Hannah Arendt, not just only the thinker. And my interest grew when I read the conversation between her, Hannah, and Martin Heidegger, the philosopher who she met when she came to the university as a young woman, 17 years old, to study philosophy and also theology, and met this much older man who was married, of course, and unfortunately also proved to be an anti-Semite. But they had this love story. And in the letters she wrote to him, she was someone else than the very rational philosopher, which I have met in the books I have read, which he had written. So I was sort of concerned and got fascinated with this discrepancy between the philosopher and the thinker and the human being or the woman. But then as I started to study more about Hannah as a person and read more on her mail correspondence, because there's a lot of mails that's been preserved between Hannah and many of her friends, I understood that her life experiences really had this profound impact on her philosophy. So a lot of the questions that she's addressing as a philosopher is questions that she had to sort of take care of, sort of understand, to be able to cope with her life. I mean, when she writes about evil, it's something that she has really experienced to her skin, so to speak. So I wanted to show the relation between Hannah's life and her thinking, and I hope I made it a bit.
Yes, and I think the really striking connections that you show between her really intimate personal experiences and her thinking, it also connects nicely with the book's focus on love and the way that Arendt writes about the dangers of depersonalization. And so I think the way that you really personalize her thinking does such great service to those themes as well. And I wonder, I guess, if you might speak a little bit more about this focus on love, because I think, as you point out in the book, especially in the kind of controversy surrounding Eichmann in Jerusalem, there's this sort of a certain kind of maybe popular association of Arendt and a kind of heartlessness. And I think that your book serves as such an interesting corrective to that kind of way of thinking. And I wonder if this was part of the stakes of this focus for you, and how this focus on love is the one that you sort of have chosen as your kind of through line throughout her life and thinking.
Well, actually, I think that love was the first theme that she wanted to study herself. I mean, her dissertation was about Augustine and his concept of love, and she analyzed his concept in different kinds of love, amongst them the friendly love, and this is something that is very profound in her life. Her friendship with a lot of people. She was a friend that was very loyal, and she stood up for her friends, and she sort of nurtured these friendships all over her life. So I think that she and Heinrich Blücher, which is the man that she lived with throughout her life until he died, they never had any children, but their friends were the family, and they were so important to Hannah. So you have to understand her as a very relational being. She was relating to other people and persons all the time. So, well, yeah.
Yeah.
I think love is something that she really wanted to understand, and to sort of manage.
Yeah, and I think the way that the book proceeds, it seems sort of like the stakes of the love that you're unpacking there, both in emerge in the context of her life, sort of her thinking about contemporary crises more broadly, and then sort of the book blurb also sort of connects the value of this thinking to contemporary crises. It seems to me also very much that your book is speaking to as it suggests, the rise of the refugee crisis and authoritarian regimes in the world today. And I was struck by this emphasis that emerges from Arendt's writing that you trace, that paying attention and remembering these important events is an act of love for the world. And so I guess I'm interested in the stakes that you see for your book in terms of contemporary crises and issues. And you say your interest came from this commitment to thinking through love and evil. And so I'm interested, was that sense of the stakes of the book there from the start, or did that just emerge through this close engagement with Arendt in the course of writing?
No, I mean that was my intention from the beginning. I have been working with Arendt and her philosophy and her texts and her books for, well, at least 15 years, maybe close to 20 years. And I've written books on responsibility, on love, on evil, guilt, and so on. And she has been a very important thinker in all of my books, really. So I've been longing for many years. I've been wanting to write this book, which concentrated on her and her life. So I'm so happy that I could make the time to do it, really. But I think, I mean, one of the things that she writes about and she thinks about a lot in her Denktagebuch, her her diary, is her need to love the world and the hardship she has in trying to love the world. And it's so interesting and touching, really, to follow her development. Yeah, I have my husband here on the other side of the the computer. If there's some words that I miss, her development from sort of being nearly opposed to the idea of loving the world, because she said after the Holocaust, she said, could we be able to love the world? Could we be able to love a world where these horrors are possible? And then in the course of time, many years later, she sort of concludes that she has to love the world, and she does love the world, even though the world is imperfect. And I think that's a lesson for all of us, really. We have to love the world, and we have to embrace the world, even if the world is not perfect. Because, I mean, loving the world is a beginning to heal the world in a way. Which of course does not mean that we have to accept everything that is wrong in the world. Hannah Arendt was not a person who was tolerant or accepting things that were not right. She was opposing to everything, really, even when it costed her a lot, because it did. Some questions or some opinions she held made her life harder than it had to be. And of course, I'm thinking about when she wrote from the trial in Jerusalem on Eichmann, where she was misinterpreted, I would say. It took her some time to sort of get over it. Yeah.
Thank you for that so much, and I'm looking forward to unpacking these ideas further as we continue. And for now, I think I want to introduce one of our panelists, Mr. Peter Biro, and to hear his perspectives on the book. So Peter L. Biro is the founder of Section 1, a democracy and civics education think tank in Toronto, Canada. He is a lawyer, educator, writer, and businessman. He is chair emeritus of the Jane Goodall Institute Global and the CEO of Newcon Optic. He has published and lectured widely on legal and political affairs and has been an outspoken advocate for civil liberties, human rights, civics education, wildlife conservation, and animal welfare. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of the Arts and the editor of Constitutional Democracy Under Stress, A Time for Heroic Citizenship. So welcome, Peter. Thank you so much for being here. And I wonder if you might like to share a bit about your responses to Dr. Heberlein's book.
Yeah, we don't have time. If we had a couple of hours, I could really unload on the way in which this extraordinary book really affected me. First of all, thank you to Natalie for inviting me to be part of this, and thank you for that introduction, Stephanie. And congratulations, Dr. Heberlein, on this masterful work that you have written. I'd like to maybe sort of respond by first of all telling you how it affected me, because obviously. Intellectually, I think it's a very important book, but my response is as much visceral as it is intellectual. And I think it's because you've done what none of the other biographers, whether it's Anne Heller, Samantha Rose Hill, or even Elizabeth Young Brule, who you acknowledge in your book, none of them have really managed to do, which is really to capture the essence of this thing, to deal with to resolve the impossible and to make it intelligible, if you will. let me, if I can, just reflect sort of my understanding of the book and how it kind of occurs to me as I read it. You've done a remarkable thing. I see three sets of parallels at work here, and parallels which, by the way, intersect, which of course, as we know, is a kind of geometrical impossibility, but I think in a way that's quite appropriate given the social reality that Hannah Arendt encounters and then gives us an account of when she talks about the impossible being made possible. So parallels may in fact be capable of intersecting. I see those parallel sets as the following. There's the philosophical and the psychological/emotional as one set of parallels, both in terms of phenomena and also in terms of forms of explanation. Then there is the love and the reality of the relationships with Heinrich Blücher, Hannah's husband, and Martin Heidegger. The different types of love, and in fact, the way in which those relationships almost stand as themes, not just in this story, but possibly in a larger account of the problem that Hannah is trying to elucidate. I experienced the book as a kind of psychological thriller, if you will. It's obviously intellectual history and it's obviously biography, but boy, is it one heck of a thriller. It's got all the elements of a thriller. It has tragedy, it has humor even in places, it has despair, it has loss, it has betrayal, it has redemption, it has violence, it has ultimately pathos, and in the end, catharsis. It has everything a great psychological thriller should have. And I had difficulty putting it down. I rushed through it and then I had to slow down on my second read because it was emotionally fantastic and full of suspense. There are so many wonderful lines in the book that are worth citing, but one that just stayed with me from the time I first wrote it. Early on in the book, you talk about Anne on a theoretical and literary level being ready to experience passion in its most destructive form, and how prescient really that was. A few pages later, you cite a letter that she writes, I think in 1928, to Heidegger, in which she says that she would have lost her right to live had she lost her love for Martin. Extraordinary statements that are very, very telling and actually dovetail with the broader themes of the book, and I think with the deeper insights that I think you elucidate. Love, and what kind of love could it have been that would lead someone like Hannah Arendt, even at an early stage in her life and in her studies, to say that she would have lost her right to live had she lost that love? Well, it would have been love as passion, right? Love very much distinct from the type of love shared with her husband. Not that love lacked passion, but clearly it wasn't defined by it. It was a love of equality, a love among equals, very different from the passionate love with Heidegger. And it was love as madness, fundamentally. But you go on to say that, love is what gives life meaning. And I think that's part of the explanation for that passionate position she takes in the 1928 letter. At the same time, while it gives life meaning, it surely does not give life clarity or elucidation or order. How can order and elucidation flow from or be produced by madness? I ask rhetorically. As for the right to live, Hannah couldn't possibly have meant that literally, given how seriously she takes rights, and as you later discuss, the right to human rights, and given how clear she is about the Holocaust's denial of that very right to live, the destruction of the equal moral personality of Jews and others, of course, through what people have referred to, Tad Homer Dixon, for example, calls catastrophic dehumanization. You've discussed it actually at some length in the book, the kind of dehumanization required to produce that kind of destruction. So the question that I see, or one of the main questions that I see coming out of the book, of course, is, or the central preoccupation even for Hannah, is the problem of having to accept, that is, to reconcile with, but not to forgive, to reconcile with the unforgivable. I forgot to mention the third kind of set of parallels, because I jumped right into that first wonderful quote of yours. But the third set of parallels that I see is the parallel, of course, between reconciliation on the one hand and forgiveness on the other. And the two do intersect at places, but they're clearly not the same. So, what is it that's unforgivable? What is it that, that Hannah can't reconcile with? Well, clearly the unforgivable. And as you've explained it, that which can't be punished and therefore can't be forgiven, which presents itself as the Holocaust, absolute evil, the impossible made possible. And so the question is, what kind of men could perpetuate this kind of absolute evil? And you briefly talk about the moral character of any man who, as I think you put it, take responsibility for their actions and create their own moral worth by a sequence of what you call reflective choices, and how to act, how not to act. So it immediately leaves us with the I think, at least to me, the obvious question: what exactly is Heidegger's moral worth? Because it's, I think, pretty difficult to conclude on any account, whether yours or anyone else's, of his history, that on some important level he wasn't complicit with that absolute evil. And I think the fact that Hannah, in a way, gives him a pass afterwards may not be so much an act of forgiveness, although I think you characterize it as a kind of forgiveness, as it is a response to her madness and the revisitation of what was always an unequal relationship before the war. And that was again an unequal relationship afterwards when they meet again, although the second time around she's the one in the superior position. But it's never the relationship of equals in the way that the relationship with Blücher is. So, I mean, the question for me is whether, reconciliation with the world in the end requires an acceptance of the phenomenon of absolute evil. And I think Hannah concludes that it does amount to that, but clearly not necessarily forgiveness of that absolute evil, just an acceptance that the world, contains it. And I think that her Amor Mundi, which you briefly talk about and which she spends a fair bit of time talking about in her work, really is all about that. In order to be able to love the world, there does have to be an acceptance of the world as it is. But clearly the question of whether one can truly forgive all that that one may reconcile with, I think remains an open question. In any event, I'll stop with that and just ask you, or at least throw out, and when for later on in the discussion, I would love to hear you riff a little bit on that line about Hannah being ready to experience passion in its most destructive form, and what that means for you.
Thank you for that, Peter, and we'll definitely put that on the table for in a few minutes. But first, I do want to invite our final panelist, Natalie De Rosier, to share her perspectives on the book as well. Natalie De Rosier is the principal of Massey College. From 2016 to 2019, she was the MPP representing the riding of Ottawa-Vanier. She was the Minister of Natural Resources and Forestry from January to June 2018. Prior to politics, she was the Dean of Law Common Law at the University of Ottawa, General Counsel of the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, Vice President Governance at the University of Ottawa, Dean of Law Civil Law, and President of the Law Commission of Canada. With Peter Oliver and Patrick Macklem, she co-edited the Oxford Handbook of Canadian Constitutional Law, and she also wrote with Louise Langevin and Marie-Pierre Nadeau, L'indemnisation des victimes de violences sexuelles et conjugales. She has received the Order of Canada, the Order of Ontario, and honorary doctorates from Université UCL, the Law Society of Ontario, the Prix Christine Tourigny, and is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. Natalie, reflecting on the book and on this conversation, is there anything you'd like to add?
Well, knowing that I was going to be on with Peter, I thought I was going to take a slightly different approach, which was to look at it from the women's perspective. And I read the book almost as a friendship through biography. Almost, I read it as though it's a letter across time from Dr. Heberlein to Hannah Arendt. And I was struck by this concept of friendship. I mean, obviously, love is very much by all the parallels that Peter speaks about. But I'll add a little bit my reading on the friendship part. In the book, Dr. Heberlein mentions that Hannah Arendt wrote a biography of a woman called Rahel Varnhagen. And she describes this writing of this biography of this woman who was a salon hostess and the daughter of a Jewish merchant as being part of a friendship across time. And I felt almost that this book was a friendship across time from Anne Heberlein toward the great Hannah Arendt. And part of it because the concept of friendship that is developed, that Hannah expresses through her multiple letters to her friends, is really a friendship of without airs, a friendship where someone will take your side, will try to understand you and not judge you, a one that will stand by you, will not abandon you, and will be there to the end. And I felt that this was the book. This was Anne Heberlein's letter to Hannah Arendt, contextualizing her, trying to explain how she had been misunderstood at times, how she made sense of her own contradictions, how she was really someone who was constantly struggling to be responsive, to be coherent, to have a self-reflection, to take responsibility for her actions. So I thought it was kind of a letter of friendship, and it to me it changed almost the way in which we conceptualize biography. It's a new way of thinking about biography, friendship through biography, and almost. So that was one point that I really like. And the other point is the importance of language, and we can come back to that in the discussion, and also the importance for me of Hannah Arendt and my work as a lawyer has been immense. And the way in which the insight about how dehumanizing the other leads to cruelty, to torture, and I mean, in our work, when we call it, it's a total institution. The prison is a total institution. Is when people are dehumanized, it leads to abuse in so many ways. So that insight, to me, it continues to be relevant today. The same way in which she talks about the refugee experience continues to be relevant today. The need to have a place to exercise rights, a country to exercise rights, and not to be stateless. I think all these themes, it was helpful to read the book to bring home and bring to the 21st century the great thoughts and thinking of Hannah Arendt. So thank you for this.
Thank you so much. I think now's maybe a good time to kind of gather these different themes that have risen, the different ways of thinking through love. Peter described this, the parallels between forgiveness and reconciliation, and the distinctions between them, and Natalie talking through friendship. So maybe, Anne, if you wouldn't mind, maybe first responding to Peter's question about sort of that riff on the relationship between forgiveness and reconciliation, especially in the context of absolute evil.
Thank you so much, both of you. I'm very happy to hear your readings of my book. And yes, I mean, it is fascinating, as you say, Peter, with this irrational side to Hannah Arendt, with this passion, which is, well, it's a kind of madness, of course, and it's not a love between equals, as he points out. It's an asymmetrical relationship. First, when Heidegger is the older, wise, married professor to this young woman who really admires him and needs him. And then after the war, of course, when he needs Hannah, because Hannah was quite important to sort of rehabilitate him in the eyes of other people. Her forgiveness, if I may call it so, was, I think, crucial for him to be able to be a part of the philosophical community again. And of course, there is this important, I mean, there's parallels between reconciliation and forgiveness, but there's also an important distinction between these two phenomena. That forgiveness, I would say, is a kind of relational response. It's forgiveness is between two persons, two human beings, two persons who wants to restore a relationship that has been broken. And to break a relationship, there has to be some kind of violation, some kind of betrayal of great importance, of course. So to forgive someone, to really forgive someone, is hard, both moral and emotional work, I would say. To reconcile, as Peter says, is more to accept something, because when you forgive, you sort of takes the guilt from someone. If you look in the biblical texts, the word forgiveness in Hebrew and also in Greek is words that have some kind of movement. You cover something or you lift something, something goes away. So when you forgive someone, you say that the guilt goes away and you will never more sort of blame the person for the things that he or she has done. But when you reconcile, reconciliation is not the same as forgiving, and it's surely not the same as forgetting, because I think you have to reconcile with the great evil in the world to be able to live in the world, but you are obliged to not forgive, I would say. So that's some kind of answer.
Well, could I just put maybe a question to you? And I don't want to belabor the point about whether Hannah actually forgave Martin or not, but you make some very, very interesting observations. And one of them is when you cite Hannah as saying that evil deeds are, and you use the word typically, so it's your word typically, it's not a quotation, that they are typically carried out by people who have not made a decision to be good or evil. They have simply not chosen a side, which is, I think, in fact, that is the most profound lesson to be learned from the banality of evil, from Eichmann in Jerusalem. But what I was going to say is, Martin is not one of those, Martin Heidegger, because in fact he did choose a side. One can justify it, explain it away, excuse it, but he chose a side. So I don't know whether he fought, and that side clearly was the side of the very evil, which Hannah herself said is an instance, a unique historical instance of making the impossible possible and giving rise to the unpunishable. Why unpunishable? Because, as you say, unforgivable, or the other way around. Unforgivable because unpunishable. So the question, I don't really much care whether Hannah in her heart forgave or didn't forgive Martin. She clearly reconciled with him. She clearly was so taken. I mean, her life was so defined by her madness for him, for her passion. But ultimately, on a sort of moral, on the moral side of this, it's difficult to imagine that she ever actually could have forgiven him. I think she made an excuse because of the passion and the madness and the uniqueness of that relationship. Appetitus, that kind of love, going back to Augustine. But it is very, very problematic to take from that he could ever have been rehabilitated. I think she saved him, and she did forgive him publicly. So it was a public rehabilitation, but on a moral level,
that was what I meant.
On Hannah's own kind of logic, it's difficult to imagine that he was ever rehabilitated. And that may be why he is such a pathetic figure on a personal level, as great a philosopher as obviously he was, but how pathetic he was in the aftermath of the war on a psychological level. because he was not susceptible of being rehabilitated, just as he could not be forgiven for the unforgivable.
Yeah, I mean,
Yes.
I think actually I agree with you. I would never write this, but I can say it. I think that maybe deep down, Hannah, she also, there was also a lot of hatred for Heidegger, I think. And in some of the letters she wrote to Mary McCarthy, but also, which is quite surprising, to Heinrich Blücher, because he was aware of this sort of relationship between Hannah and Heidegger. Some things she writes there sort of insinuates that she feels this hate for Heidegger. I mean, she thinks, as you say, that he is quite a pathetic figure. And I think that was a great disappointment for her, because she admired him so much. And she really thought of him as a soulmate, as the one person in the world who could understand her thinking. And I mean, it's quite interesting, if you read Heidegger's philosophy and if you read Hannah's, I mean, she has had this great impact on his thinking as well, which you may not always acknowledge, because he is sort of constructed as her intellectual father. But I think that she was very, very important for him, because he really needed this young, bright, intellectual thinking woman to discuss with. He was married to this German kind of a Brünnhilde type. Yeah, eine Hausfrau. And she was not a partner that he could discuss with. So he was infatuated with Hannah, of course. And I mean, his so-called Black Diaries were published. Yeah. I mean, it's later. I think it's 10 years later, ago or something like that.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. I mean, she never read his Black Diaries, because when you read these Black Diaries, which really are black in so many ways, you can't deny that he was really, I mean, he shows side, as you say. But she wanted to sort of believe, and maybe she tried to fool herself, that he was like this philosopher who was only thinking about the metaphysics and so on, that he didn't really understand what he was doing or saying, or who he was signing up to. So,
well, she may have confused his need for her with a respect for her, which he may never have had. I mean, he never accepted her fully as a philosopher.
And that's a tragedy, because I think that was what she was really longing for. She wanted him to respect her. I mean, it's quite touching that everything that she wrote, she sort of sent to him, because she wanted him to say that this is very good, Hannah. She wanted some kind of acknowledgement for him, and he never gave it to her, never. And maybe he knew that if he one day gave her that acknowledgement, all the magic will be gone. I mean, the need, she would not have the need for him. But I mean, that's the psychological reason.
Yeah, I know. But we all are doing it a little bit when we read the book, because the exploitation of a professor to a student, then this constant demand that she waits, that she does this, and then she can never let go. She has for her own sanity to keep him a little bit on a pedestal, and so she keeps him there. And I was quite convinced that she had not read the Dark Diaries, and that in a way we never know truly someone that we are in love with and put on a pedestal until they fall off and we read the dark side or the other side.
When we do fall in love with someone, we fall in love with our own imagination of them, I think.
That's it. Yeah, so that's true.
We sort of make up this ideal person, and we fall in love with our idea of this person. And it's, I mean, we like our own ideas, don't we? So we're sort of attached to our own imaginations, I think. And I really loved your reading of my book as a letter of friendship from me to Hannah. Actually, because I worked with this book for a long time, over a couple of years. So when I finally finished it, I was in a kind of a mourning period, actually, because I missed having this sort of dialogue or conversations with Hannah on a daily basis. And when she wrote this book about Rahel van Hagen, as you mentioned, a Jewish woman who had this intellectual saloon, and she's for Hannah, she describes Rahel as someone who taught her to be Jewish, actually, because when she grew up, it was with two very secularized parents. She had a grandparent who they were active in the synagogue, and she really loved to follow him to the synagogue, and she loved all the histories and so on. But she says someone that it was other people who told her that she was Jewish. She didn't really know what it was to be a Jew. So Rahel van Hagen was someone who showed her the way, someone whom she could sort of hold hands with in her finding her own way of being a Jewess. And it's fantastic, and I think that we can do so. We can have friends who are dead and friends who are just imaginary in a way, and they can mean a lot to us.
I wanted to, I guess, pick up on another part of Natalie's reading, because I think that this description of friendship contrasts to sort of the relationship with Heidegger that we were just talking about, because you describe, the stability of her friendships and the way in which her husband Heinrich became like her four walls is the expression that's often used, and that sense of home. And then also you describe home for her as being the German language. And so I wanted to, I guess, invite Natalie to share the question she alluded to about the interest in language that emerges from the book, the way that language is a kind of home. And then, of course, thinking about this book as a translation as well was something I was thinking about. But I want to invite Natalie, I guess, to expand on that reading.
Well, I think that, to me, that has always been fascinating, that how she continued to be attached to the German language. As she said, it's not the German language that went crazy. But I sympathize with her, partly because of who I am. When you live in your mind, you want to have the right words to say it. The entire intellectual exercise is about finding the words to say it in the appropriate way. You have to have the right idioms, the right sentence that will be remembered, that captures the reality. And this struggle to do it in another language, it's so overwhelming. And so it demands a lot of energy, it demands a lot of humility. And so anyway, that entire part of the book, I was reading it with eagerness, because in French, there's an expression, there's a book that's called Les mots pour le dire, the words to say it. You need to find the words to say it. And often when you are in an intellectual conversations, if you're not from that culture, from that language, you're lacking the ability to convey fully your meaning, and you may be misunderstood. So to me, it was more like projecting myself onto this book and trying to say, and eventually she conquers this. She becomes well known in English as much as it is. But my question to you is the impact of language, the translation that we're reading a translation, but you speak and obviously understand beautiful English. Was that an issue for you, this sort of communication à travers, in between languages?
Well, you mean that the book was translated from Swedish to English?
Yes, and then you had to read her in
yes.
In
Well,
German.
not really the translation from Swedish to English, but the book has been translated in other languages as well, as it's to Dutch, for example. It's been it's now being translated to Chinese, and I mean, I'm not able to understand either Dutch or Chinese or Portuguese or some of the other languages as the book has been translated to, and that's strange, of course. But I'm very pleased with the English translation. I had this fantastic translator, Alice Menzies, which I had a lot of dialogue with during her process. she was fantastic, and we had this conversation by email mostly when she was insecure about something. So I feel 100% content with this translation. But in this conversation with you, of course, I feel I can understand exactly what you're saying, because I feel sort of, I feel sort of handicapped actually, because I can't really find the words. And I think, well, I'm much better than this. So, I try my best.
Well, this book certainly feels. Sorry, I was saying this book certainly feels like it was written in English. I mean, one has no sense that this is a translation from anything. It feels so, kudos to the translator. There's so many wonderful turns of phrase. I was thinking of one, can't remember exactly how you framed it, but at one point you're contrasting Blücher to Hannah's previous lovers, who I think, as you put it, were all thin men with soft hands. And I remember, in contrast to Blücher, and I remember just stopping and smiling and laughing out loud when I read that. And of course, it's so clear. I mean, that it's a wonderful turn of phrase. It's a wonderful, lovely contrast, but it's also a very, very powerful statement about their different characters, even their different moral characters. And one can feel that there's something there's a certain truth in the hardiness of en français on dirait un gars un peu costaud, someone with a bit of, who's physically stronger and meets the world not only intellectually but physically and in other ways as well, socially as well, as more gregarious, which Heinrich Blücher was. So all I can say is that the language did a fantastic job of conveying wonderful nuances in meaning throughout.
So not to interrupt in the conversation, but I think we do start to have some audience questions coming in. And I do want to take this moment to signal to attendees that you're more than welcome to submit questions for Dr. Heberlein or for our panel. So we have a question from Aaron Wenland, and he's asking, what is the relationship between madness and forgiveness? I wonder if, Anne, you want to respond to that.
Oh, that was an interesting question. But in some ways, and I think actually I have said it during this conversation, I think forgiving is often irrational, actually. And as, was it Aaron who posed the question? Aaron? Yes, as Aaron sort of indicates, I think sometimes it could be mad to forgive. And to be serious here for a moment, I mean, you do often see that women forgive men who beats them. I mean, I'm speaking about domestic violence, of course. And I mean, when you forgive a person who treats you really bad, you put yourself in a situation which is potential dangerous, of course. I remember lecturing for a group of police officers a couple of years ago, and one of the male police officers, was so frustrated because he told that they were called out to the same house, the same apartment from time to time, and the woman was beaten up, and then she didn't want to report a man. She forgave and she forgave and she forgave, and he said that sometimes we will be too late and we will find her dead, actually. So yes, it could be madness to forgive in those circumstances, of course. Sometimes the best thing you can do is not to forgive, because in that kind of situation, if you don't forgive, you give both yourself and the one that you don't forgive a chance to be a better person. But if you forgive someone, and forgiveness means a fresh start, and that you can really be a better person, because I mean, forgiveness is a gift. It's a precious gift to give to someone who has treated you bad, to say, I forgive you. And it should be handled with care, of course. But I mean, all these very strong feelings, love and passion, and so on. I mean, they're close to madness, all of them, I think.
A related word that comes to mind for me from the book is this idea of imagination. And I think one thing you deal with in this really interesting way is the way that imagination was key to survival, both in terms of the ability to hope and imagine a future. And at the same time, you discuss Arendt's ability to imagine the worst continually as being key to her survival. I wonder if you would speak a little bit about that relationship and the role of imagination to survival.
Yeah, I mean, that's so interesting because she was in the Camp Gurs, which is this internment camp in France, with a lot of other Jewish women, and she had she had a double imagination there, I would say, because at the same time she was imagining the worst to happen, and at the same time she imagined that there was a future beyond this, because there is this passage where she writes to one of her friends, I think it's called Blumenfeld, that once in that camp she posed herself the question if she was going to commit suicide, because her despair was so big. And then she concluded that suicide is sort of an answer to an individual problem, and that she was in this camp was not an individual problem, really. It was because of something else. So she didn't give up hope, and she was able to think that there should be a future. The contrast to Hannah here is, of course, her very good friend Walter Benjamin, who sadly took his life on the border of Port-Bau. He didn't have the same ability as Hannah to imagine something better. He didn't have that ability to hope, to feel hope. And at the same time, as you say, she was very suspicious. She was so suspicious that her friends often sort of mocked her about it, because she was always imagining the worst to come. But I think that saved her as well. I mean, her ability to not just think that everything would be all right, but really imagined the worst things. And there is this story when they are in Montauban, Hannah and Heinrich and a lot of the friends, and there is this kind of note in the newspaper that all Jews should report to the local police station. And she said, no, we should not do that, because she had been reading a lot of Maigret novels. And she said, they don't work this way. So don't do it, because if we do it, they will just leave our names and addresses to the Nazis when they come here. And it was, of course, during the Vichy regime. So yeah, I think really her imagination, her ability to her fantasy, it was of great importance to her and for her survival.
Yeah, and
I
guess
on that question as well for a second. I thought, Stephanie, that your question about imagination is very important. At the very end of the book, and you talk about how she ends up reconciling with the world, indeed loving the world, and speaking about the possibility of change. And of course, it requires a certain amount of imagination to do that. And it calls to mind of another very dear friend of mine, Jane Goodall, who presents, exactly in the same way. There is, on the one hand, a recognition of a certain amount of doom, a certain reality that one cannot help but acknowledge, and at the same time, reason for hope. And it seems to me, and I've discussed this with her many times, she always calls me a pessimist, and I always call her an impossible optimist. And I think in the end, that kind of hopefulness requires a certain, concerted cognitive dissonance, if you will, a conscious willingness to suspend disbelief in order to act in the world. And I think for Hannah, there is a little bit of a parallel, for example, at the way that she responds to the death of Socrates, intellectually, but also emotionally, in contrast to the way that Plato did, right? I mean, he retreated to the world of ideas, recognizing that philosophy simply had no place in the city-state, in the polis, that it would always be betrayed. Hannah, perhaps recognizing that, simply kind of puts that to one side, as she does in the sense with the Holocaust itself, and says, it is still necessary to act and to hope and to agitate, to both advocate and agitate for for positive change in the world. But again, I think there's a kind of cognitive dissonance that's required to be able to hold those two positions.
Thank you. And I guess I'm cognizant that our allotted time today is drawing near to the end. So I want to invite, I guess, Anne and Natalie and Peter as well, if you have any sort of final reflections you wanted to share before time wraps up, maybe starting with Anne. Is there anything we haven't gotten to?
To sort of relate to what you said, Peter, because I think that what you're speaking about is like it's a great art, and it's a difficult art to be able to both see the world as it is, doing that, see all the troubles and problems like the climate crisis and so on, without falling into despair, to be able to see things clearly and keep your hope, as I think that you explains Jane Goodall is doing. So it's not all of us that are able to do that, but we need people and persons who are able to perform that very difficult art, I think. And of course, Hannah was she was great at doing that.
Well, I'm just going to say how important the book is in several respects. Number one, for people, for the Massey community, many of them and our junior fellows who want to become public intellectuals, I think Hannah Arendt is a model for this, being present to the world, discussing it, writing about it, understanding it, trying to make sense of it. I think so. We can never read enough about her and about her model. And this, as I said, this biography is so special in a way because you get to understand much more than the outside. It's from the inside out, and it is a book about loyalty, about friendship, and so it feels good to read it as well. And finally, I think it puts many of the ideas can be related to our current dilemmas. So I think we draw not only from Hannah Arendt, but we also draw from Dr. Heberlein in understanding our world.
Well, let me just add that to that. Yes, I mean, Dr. Heberlein, you have performed an extraordinary service for readers of Arendt and students of political philosophy and psychology, and as I said at the outset, people who just love and want to be immersed in a fabulous psychological thriller. I'm sure that others may not have described the book quite in those terms, but I can assure anyone out there who has not yet read this book that it will captivate you in all the ways that a great thriller does, and also deepen your understanding of many important questions. So just read this book, buy this book, share this book. It's an important book, and I am very grateful I had a chance to read it and to participate in this discussion with you.
Yes.
Thank you so much. I'm so honored and so happy to be able to have this conversation with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your biography, psychological thriller, friendship letter, all of these different things we've discussed. And thank you to everyone for being here today, especially our panel, Dr. Anne Heberlein, author of Love and Tyranny, Life and Politics of Hannah Arendt, which I hope you will go find after this conversation, and to our panelists, Peter Biro and Natalie De Rosier. It's been a pleasure to discuss this wonderful book with you all and to consider what it might mean, as the book says, to love the world so much that we think change is possible. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.